All right. Hey, y'all. Afternoon, friends. It's really good to see y'all in this space. I know we're zooming in from all over the country. We got West Coast up in Michigan, Deep South represented, and East Coast too. So, what I was thinking is, for some of the most meaningful conversations that I've had in my life has always been around a table and around a meal. So, I wonder if we could just like imagine ourselves sitting together, maybe in a field somewhere, since we all work in food systems, a beautiful farm, and sitting around a round table, about to enjoy a beautiful meal together, and sharing conversation. So y'all down with that? We all sitting around a table together, about to enjoy a meal and a great conversation amongst friends and peers. Um, and so maybe, just as kind of to kick us off, maybe I'll try and set the table. Um, so we all come to this conversation and this meal from really different places, perspectives, lived experiences. But I think we all really share a passion and a deep belief in the power of food as a tool for change, and a tool for really transformative change. And I think we come at it, and us and thousands of other people who work in this field of the good food movement, which we can kind of dig into. We come at it from all these different intersections, whether it's through health or a desire to support the environment and steward the environment. Maybe it's through like economic and community development, maybe culture and art and connection, spirituality. Like, folks come to food as this tool for change from a lot of different lenses. But I think what unites us is this shared belief in it being a very powerful tool or a medium for affecting social change. And over the years, as all these different sort of movements within one movement, um, I think it's kind of collectively become known as the good food movement. About 10 years ago or so, I think the Kellogg Foundation led a process of defining what that meant: good food. And it was defined as healthy, green, fair, and affordable. And healthy meaning nourishment, food that nourishes our bodies and our minds; green in that it's sustainable for the environment; fair in that there's not exploitation in the production and consumption of food; and affordable in that it's accessible to all people. And I think that from my perspective and kind of understanding what good food is, I think it's that's like kind of a comprehensive and uniting platform in a way, but it also doesn't explicitly name equity. And I think that, for me, that it's buried, like equity and anti-racism gets buried within that definition. And it's sort of assumed that it's part of fairness, but it's not explicitly named. And so for me, myself, and my own journey in this work as being a part of the good food movement, it's become really important to me to really pick that apart and understand, what does it mean to call something a good food movement if we're not explicitly naming the root of many of the issues that keep us from having good food, that keep us from having healthy food, keep us having green, fair, affordable. Like, when we start to ask why don't we have healthy food? Why don't we have accessible food? When you do those like 5 whys, it almost always gets down to racial inequity, racism in the food system, and capitalism, which we know are completely intertwined. And so I think that's, what this conversation today is about. It's like, how do we, as the good food movement, as members of the good food movement, move towards, creating a more equitable and explicitly anti-racist food system? So that's the conversation that I think we're coming here together to have today. And I thank y'all for making the time to be here. Um, and Lindsay, maybe you could kind of give us a little bit of insight as to why this group of people, and this question.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, pass the potatoes. Really glad to be at the table with you. I don't know why potatoes is always like my go-to imaginary food, right? But it is. But I'm glad to be here and also to be surrounded by my other network weavers. So myself, I've had the honor and the experience of being a network weaver. And we all have. And so one of the things and one of the reasons why this conversation came up, this was one of the original questions that was posed to us all as network weavers when we first started this journey. And so we came together as colleagues and questioned, how can we have this conversation as a group in a way that is not all telling, but definitely full of experience and full of our own insights and own angles, and to kind of time capsule where we are and how we think around this conversation. And like you said, Susan, we're representing so many different walks of life, so many different regions in this country, and so many different experiences. So and we don't all, besides being network weavers, we all have different shared connections. So I think it's really important, and we thought it was really important. And Rachel and I came together to really try to lay out a blueprint to show how we could take this from just a written network weaver idea to like a verbal conversation. And so that's kind of how we got together. And the weavers were like, that's a good idea. Like, let's talk about it. Like, let's actually leave our words in the ether, in the ethno space, like in the out there. Let's put down what we want to say. So we're really excited to come together and just show you how we relate. And the hope is for other people listening, that you can begin to have similar conversations with people from different regions that you may not be familiar with, but maybe peers or colleagues with. And you can wrap your mind around these questions. And like with the example Susan gave of questioning and really being intentional with your word choice, and looking for equity in the root of things. So really happy to just get into this, and to be able to get into how we are all connected, Susan. And you are a great part of those connections. So I know you can definitely kind of shed light on how we all came to sit at this table together.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's pretty easy and short. It's through the Food Systems Leadership Network. That's how we've all met and connected. And so I just think that's really beautiful. That's really the whole point of the network, is to connect people across communities. And that's, really representative of who's here today. So, and I could just get kicked off. I'm Susan. I'm zooming in from New Orleans, Louisiana. I was born and raised in Louisiana, which is where I first got really passionate about food. My church had a garden growing up, and I was gardening every Sunday, and really started to believe in just the power of connection through food, and it's been woven throughout my career and my life. And with my deep roots in Louisiana, I was called back here after being gone for a long time. Around 2018 is when I moved back, and it's about that time that I met Marcus, who's also from Louisiana. And I think you had just moved back to take a job at Louisiana State University, to run their new Grow Louisiana program. And I remember we had a couple phone chats and connected. And one of the things that you said, Marcus, that really stuck with me is that we got to move beyond talk into action. We were kind of swapping notes about how there's a whole lot of meetings, but not necessarily a whole lot of action, in the food systems work in Louisiana, and at that time at least. And so we really connected around that, and I just had an appreciation for you from the get-go. So that's how we met. So
Yeah,
Marcus, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
sure. Thanks, Susan. As Susan said, I'm Marcus Coleman. I'm primarily based here at Louisiana State University, where I run a beginning farmer and training program. I'm also adjunct faculty across town at Southern University, which is our 1890 university here in the state, teaching courses in agricultural marketing and management. I guess my interest in food and in food access, I grew up in rural Louisiana. I grew up in a community that was is strictly based on farming. That's the entire economy in that community, and just to see that in the parish that I'm from is one of the three poorest parishes in the state, and so just the amount of agricultural productivity that we have in that area. But that agricultural productivity didn't lend to people having access to good food. And people in that region struggle. You know, if you think about it, almost half of the people in that region of the state are on SNAP benefits. But if you look at those three parishes, the three parishes around the area that I'm from, there aren't any major supermarket chains in those areas to service those. And so there are a number of different issues that relate to food access that comes from that. And I think what really got me to hone in on my interest in this area was I spent 6.5 years at Michigan State University. And while I was in the Ag Econ department there, a lot of folks were doing work in international development. And so they were doing research and studies related to food access and producer business development in areas like sub-Saharan Africa. And I was like, well, why isn't anybody in this department doing this work right down the road in Detroit? And so that really, spurred my interest in through involvement with this group, I got the chance to meet Winona, and I spent 6.5 years there at Michigan, and we were doing some good stuff, some good work with food deserts in Detroit. And in meeting Winona and the work that she's doing with the Detroit Food Policy Council, I'm inspired, given the time that I spent there in Michigan, that, some good things are happening in Detroit. And so I'll just shoot that over to Winona.
Thanks, Marcus. And as Marcus said, I'm Winona Bynum. I'm the Executive Director of the Detroit Food Policy Council. And what you and Susan have both talked about, to me, really resonates. I was born and raised in Detroit, have lived here my whole life. And both my grandparents had fruit trees and gardens. So one had an apple tree, so there were a lot of apple pies and apple everything, and another one had cherries. Food was just a big part of our life. I spent my summers in the South on my great-grandparents' farm, and they kept a working farm with animals and produce. And so just it seemed a natural part of life, even though I was raised in the city. And when I got a chance to change careers and become a dietitian, part of that work while I was in school, changing careers, was getting a chance to really work in my community and seeing that so many people didn't have access to healthy food and just the different layers. And it really changed the focus of my work. I always say that I had planned to tell people to eat carrots. And then I changed it to trying to make sure that they were able to get carrots. So just that focus, because if people can't access it, they can't eat healthfully. I get a chance to work with a lot of coalitions in my work and be a part of a lot of organizations working towards a better food system, a more equitable food system. Part of that work took me to DC, where I got to meet Lindsay. And Lindsay and I were both part of Good Food for All in Washington, DC. And we got a chance to advocate to our lawmakers. And I was really impressed by Lindsay's energy. So when I saw her here with the Food System Leaders Network, I was just really happy to get a chance to work more closely with her again. And so I will hand it off to Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Winona. You can't, maybe if you're not viewing this, you can't see it, but you definitely have me smiling ear to ear. And that's how it was when I got to meet you in DC. That was a really wonderful experience, getting that chance, like you said, to lobby. Myself, I'm a recent PhD graduate of Tuskegee University, and I just got my doctorate in integrative public policy and development. So it was really wonderful to be doing some of that experience while network weaving and working with you all. And also just to look at the way that policy works. So I definitely started my work I would say after graduating from Tuskegee. I did go to Tuskegee in my undergraduate studies, and after graduating and being like, I don't want to get out. I really want to get out there. I want to get out in the field and working in community gardens. And then starting to realize, like, it's not that the people don't want to grow food and consume food and eat food. It's there's not policies that really support these programs and support people that want to make careers in making sure food is getting grown in their communities by people that live in their communities. And so that kind of definitely took me into the world of policy, and then also into just looking at a food system And I was able to join the Food Systems Leadership Network after actually running into Susan at a conference years ago. So shout out to those conferences and those interminglings, because being in the Food System Leadership Network, I got to go to the Food System Leadership Network retreat. Guys, I'm just going to start saying FSLN from now on. But I went to the FSLN retreat where I met Rachel, which was amazing for me. Outside of just network weaving, Rachel and I have had a connection as colleagues, and I would also say as friends. It's definitely grown from just knowing each other in the network, and her living in North Alabama and me living, her living in North. Now she lives in North Alabama, folks. Before she lived in North Florida and I lived in South Alabama. So we were close, and we actually got to hike together, and Rachel like kind of helped copy read my dissertation for me, and like all types of like really helpful steps as I was like matriculating and growing. So I was really happy that even though I went all the way out to New Orleans at a gathering, which was the retreat that brought people together from all over the world, I was able to link up with a food system leader in my own backyard, side beach area that I could work with. And we've been able to work and do some cool programs, not only here for the Wallace Center, but abroad. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to working with Rachel and being quiet now and letting Rachel speak for herself.
Cool. Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, y'all. My name is Rachel Reichenbach. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really thrilled that the way that this introduction round has ended up is people talking about how they got into food systems work. It's been sweet to hear y'all's reflections and to think about my own response. I think I always had a sort of intuitive sense that food was this like tool or vehicle for connection. And so I was always interested in it, but there was a moment in my mid-20s where I was having sort of an existential crisis that was like, when the apocalypse comes, I don't have any skills. You know, I have this fancy education, I can think critically, I can write and speak nicely, but like, what use am I when the shit really hits the fan? And I thought, okay, I have to grow food. I have to start a garden. And so through that, I was gardening and connecting with some local farmers and started managing the farmers market and sort of held various roles in the food system. But and I had started to see these connections or these relationships or these threads, or when our program, I used to work for a Double Up program in Florida, our Finney funded nutrition incentive program. And right, we would make this choice, but it would create this impact that we didn't anticipate, or we would have this intention, but we would actually end up doing this that we hadn't thought would happen. And so I was starting to see all of these connections or disconnections. And then I went to the Food Systems Leadership Retreat. And it blew my mind, because it was like, oh, all of these things that I've sort of intuitively been seeing or thinking about, here's a language and here's a field and here's a community of people who are thinking and approaching the work in a similar way. So these days I find myself doing no food growing. I realize that is not my role in the food system. There are people much more talented at it than I am. And these days I find myself more in the role of a convener or a facilitator. I have my own consulting practice called Resist Reimagine, and my deepest desire is to be of service and support to groups who are trying to co-create the stories of the new world, and to really help folks and lend my skills and experience to help folks think about how are we collaborating, how are we using power, and how are we making strategies that take us to where we want to go in a way that feels aligned with who we are and who we want to be. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm gonna break the pattern. Shelly and I have never actually met before. We were network weavers together, but we do have a thread of connection in that we're both Southerners. Shelly's from Arkansas and went on and got her undergrad and master's degree in Georgia. And I'm from Dallas, and I've spent the last 5 years in Florida, and at the end of 2020 moved up to Alabama. So I'll pass it over to Shelly, who's now out west on that thread of Southern connection.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Shelly Dyer, and yes, I'm currently based in the Bay Area. I live in Oakland, California, but I was born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas, where my love for food really just grew. Food is life. Food is life down south. So I grew up riding my bicycle to pick honeysuckles and filling a bag and just eating as many honeysuckles that my fingers would allow me to before getting tired. And going out to Pinky, Arkansas on my Uncle George's farm to pick collard greens and taste them and let him know when they were ready to harvest. And even goes to like food being a part of my family's legacy. My grandfather on my father's side passed away before I was born, but had the best pecan tree in Arkansas where I would go and pick pecans as a little girl. I never got to meet him in person, but that was just a way that I got to connect with my ancestors, was through food, through the pecans. And yeah, it's just been such a big part of my life. My first job was at Community Bakery in Little Rock, Arkansas. One of my favorite spots to visit to this day. So it's just been a common theme throughout my life. My career started in education as a teacher in Atlanta Public Schools, and my students were really my inspiration for getting engaged in food systems work. Whenever I would bring my lunches to school, sometimes meals that seemed really typical for me were totally new foods to them. And so I started a cooking class in my classroom just to expose my students to new or healthier ways of eating. And from that, I'm a big fan of soul food and the foods of the African diaspora. So I started teaching cooking classes that really highlighted African or Afrocentric foods as healthy foods, and as a way to teach culturally relevant cooking classes to people of the African diaspora and really highlight that food as healthy food as well. So currently I'm working as the quality assurance manager at the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, and that is what brings me to the Bay Area. It's so good to be here with y'all today, and I will pass it back to Susan.
Yeah. Oh man. I was just thinking too, Shelly, like you and I met in Little Rock.
Yeah.
To bring it full circle. So, and I think it was at Community Bakery. We met up for a cup of coffee, and
Yes.
me and Andrew got to connect with you, and that's how we initially build relationships. So I think for me, one of the most beautiful things about this work is the people that we get to connect with. And y'all are all such wonderful human beings. So it's really cool to sit at this table with you today. So maybe just to kind of kick us off, I'm gonna ask this this first question. Like, why does this conversation matter to you? What brings you to the table, and why is it so important that the good food movement be equitable and explicitly anti-racist? And whoever feels the spirit, just jump on in.
I think that it's one of those things, at least for me, growing up in the community and seeing the people who grow the food actually being the ones that succeed, but everybody else in the community not having access to the same resources. I mean, isn't that a part of what the American dream should be? People having access to good food, and it's almost like now that good food and good quality, nutritious food is a luxury. Only the people who can afford it get to engage in that. And so, for me, in being a person in this 1862 land grant system, where oftentimes a Black voice isn't really heard in this community to talk about these things or to raise light to these issues to people, it's important to me. It's important to me to be myself and to be able to express my views on what I think is important. And ultimately in these spaces, when decisions are made on training programs, or policy decisions are made that affect communities of color when related to access to good food, there typically isn't any representation in the room that can speak on behalf of those communities, or even that resembles what the communities look like, or even have had the experiences of the communities. And so these conversations are important to me, because unless those conversations are had, unless people get a different perspective outside of the perspective that their lived experiences, they can't possibly understand. And even if conversations are had, it's just the starting point to opening folks' eyes to a different side of the world that they may not have been able to engage in.
That resonates with me. And what, Susan, when you were talking in the beginning and talking about asking the whys, so often nothing makes us reflect on why things are the way they are, or why these inequities exist. And so we have to have these explicit conversations that really talk about why, that we reflect on why things are the way they are so that we can change them. And then we have all been influenced by the things around us. So, Shelley, when you talked about having those cooking classes and teaching that soul food can be healthy, so often it's only portrayed as something that is not healthy, that is uninformed, that is backwards. And you even hear people of color saying those same things. But the truth of the matter is that Black folks have been eating more beans and greens that are healthy and having a vegetarian-based diet for very long and had a lot of healthy things. And so tweaking it, and that's one of the things as a dietitian I would talk about. But if we don't have those explicit conversations, we will never get to the root of it. We will never be able to talk about how things change, and representation does matter, to be able to be in the room and even talk about how things, again, unintended consequences, how a person or a group may be impacted if we don't have those people there with the lived experience that can say, you're well-intentioned, but this is going to go awry here, then we will never get to where we're trying to be. So we really do have to have these conversations. And I've been so grateful to be able to have the conversations over this past year with y'all.
I'm happy to jump in. I was really struck by what you said, Marcus, about, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect of like, shouldn't being able to access healthy, affordable food, shouldn't that be a part of the American dream? And as I was reflecting on why is this question important to me, I was just reflecting on, I have this deeply felt sense that it doesn't have to be this way. Susan, you named capitalism and white supremacy as these like intersecting systems of oppression that create so much harm and violence for all of us, and especially for Black, Indigenous, people of color. And capitalism and white supremacy impede all of our abilities to experience safety and freedom and joy. And so it's like, I want to live in a world that is safer and more free and more joyful. And so as somebody who is not motivated by altruism, but is motivated by like my own desire to live with more freedom, safety, and joy, it's like I have to be invested in dismantling white supremacy if I want to get to where I want to go, which is a place where I think we would all be experiencing more safety, freedom, and joy. So, and just making that point explicit, like especially for white folks, like to be engaged in a conversation about equity and anti-racism, if it's rooted in a sense of altruism, it's a shallow rootedness. So how do we really start to reflect on like why does anti-racism and equity not only matter for all of us, but like what do white people have to gain when we roll up our sleeves and get down to this work as well?
Here, having those conversations around anti-racism and equity being a part of the Good Food movement are so important. Really, as I mentioned earlier, often Eurocentric standards their Eurocentric recipes or cuisines can often be the focus of what health standards look like for all communities. And, that's something I'm really passionate about is all communities of color, people have some types of recipes that are historically healthy. So just to be able to highlight that and foster that self-appreciation for your own historical cuisines is just so important. You can't talk about food or spices without talking about geography, politics, and food history. So those conversations around anti-racism and equity are so key to just really, really building the momentum around a good food movement.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Brett. I'm sorry, Lindsay.
No, I was just gonna add, like, I'm so inspired by this question and just the answers that were given, and just the kind of connections amongst us all as weavers too. So the core of my dissertation was and the title of it was on soul food as healing. So reclaiming reclaiming narratives around African-American foodways and food systems. And so what I really focused on my research was exactly like you're saying, Shelley, this question of like, soul food isn't healthy. And I started that trek when I was like, well, you know, they say food as medicine. What about soul food as medicine? And people were like, soul food's not medicine. Like, it's the reason Black people are sick. And I was like, really? Like, my grandma, like the woman who instilled in me, you don't eat pizza, you don't eat French fries, you don't eat McDonald's, you eat collard greens, you eat food I cook for you, I touched it, I know what's in it. That kind of like, she's the reason why. And then you see like, you know, Huey and like all the, you ever seen the cartoon Boondocks or like the movie Soul Food? You see like the big mama getting her leg cut off of her foot because of diabetes, and all these narratives around shame. And then I started to think even back like watermelon, like when we ate watermelon, that was shamed, and watermelon is full of lycopene. So it's just like, really investigating this narrative. And you said it earlier, Winona, about carrots. That really rung to me because we like to look at micro factors a lot, like how many carrots did you eat today? But we don't look at like the systemic factors of like how long was your father wrongly in prison for like some crack code 1990 law stuff that he didn't really deserve, and what did that do to your mother, and what did that do inside of your womb, like when you were being carried, like what did these generations of compounding stress, like how did that hurt you? And last thing on this, there's a lot of research, especially in the South, like older white folk and older Black folk, they eat fried chicken the same with the same amount, but have different health outcomes. So, you know, it's Southern food. It's soul food when I cook it. It's Southern food when Paula Deen cooks it. It's comfort food when it shows up on Food Network. You know, so it's all the same food, but we racialize who cooks it. So I guess just kind of saying on like why this question is important now is like, if you're going to tell the story, tell it all, you know, tell it all. And that's what I think now is the time of telling the whole story.
But without those conversations, you just never get to that point where you're looking at it, you just swallow it and you say, oh yeah, soul food is bad for you. But to your point, as being a dietitian, when I got to study it, no, it was so much wisdom. I just remember my great grandmother, when you were sick, you were supposed to drink pot liquor from like the vegetables. Well, that made sense because it's full of vitamins. Like they didn't know that, but it was really a health tonic. Or if you're out in the field, sodium is good for you so that you won't die from heat stroke. You know what I mean? So it was a lot of wisdom in that, but without having these conversations and unraveling those racist messages and uncovering them, you never get to the real deal. So that's so important. And I just love having these conversations.
Words really matter. And after hearing everything that y'all just said and things that I've been wrestling with myself, like I think we need to scrap this good food title because good is so loaded and people like interpret that in so many different ways of like what good food means. I mean, I did just a Google search and so many different things came up and I'm like, this is kind of meaningless, honestly. And I don't think it's the kind of power and intention behind it that is obviously within this conversation. And I know that this conversation is shared by thousands of other folks across the country too. So I think it's time that we as a community like redefine that. Or choose another way of naming this work that we're doing that feels more authentic to like what we're really bringing to the table, what we're really talking about, because good isn't cutting it.
You know, one of the interesting things to me is you know, understanding the cultural and historical significance of different types of food. I always laugh when I see, whether it's a rural community or in some community, minority community here in Baton Rouge, where somebody from outside the community goes in and starts a community garden, and they mean well, but oftentimes the things that are grown don't relate to the community, and so, you know, going into a community and growing kale and you know, collard and mustard greens are nowhere to be found. I go back to, so in my hometown, a young lady started a community garden, and they've been inviting my grandmother to go out there and check out the community gardens. Well, I asked her, I say, "Mom, you going out there and you know, participate in the community garden and hang out?" She was like, "No, they only grow those little punk ass greens out there. They don't grow any the greens that I'm used to." And she was used to like these big broadleaf collard greens and those things, and so she couldn't relate to what was going on out there. And so I just, you know, I think that when we're doing these things, we do have to, you know, give consideration to to the cultural and historical aspects of food that, you know, our elders have long and pushed.
I think that's a brilliant segue into this next question that we wanted to sit with around, you know, in our efforts in the broader movement's efforts to center equity and anti-racism in this work. What have y'all tried? What have you seen tried? And what's worked and what's failed? Where are these conversations really landing and leading to action and behavior change, and where are they fizzling out and not having the impact? Either conversations or programs. Best intentions don't always lead to the impact that we want to have.
What Marcus shared really resonated with me around the example of a person or organization coming in a community, starting a community garden and having kale and no collard or mustard greens when that's what the people in that neighborhood may be most familiar with. What I've seen that's worked is really well as a farmer's market in Oakland called Freedom Farmers Market. It was actually my first job when I moved to the Bay Area, was to manage that market, and really my entry into the professional world of food systems work. All of the farmers that vend at that market are Black farmers. And so they're growing purple hull peas, crowder peas, sweet potatoes, collard greens, you know, selling chow chows and all types of old school jams that the Southern older ladies like to make. So you have this market where there are Black farmers in a Black neighborhood. There's likely Al Green playing in the background, and there might be an electric slide pop out in the middle of the market. They accept EBT and all of the local food stamps that folks in that community have access to. And a lot of the staff there are Black or allies and have some connection to that community. In order for strategies or like real change to happen, communities that are impacted by racial injustices really have to be at the table as decision makers, and really a part of communities that the vibe and the essence is really created with them as the center. So that's what I've really seen that works, is when people from communities that are experiencing any types of injustices are a part of that decision-making process within an environmental context that is really created and designed just for them. And by them, really, it's them having the buy-in and the opportunity to take on leadership roles within any types of community efforts.
Shelley, I so agree with you on that. And in Detroit, we have a unique environment in that it is a majority minority city. So growing up, you know, I grew up with a Black mayor. I grew up with a city council that looked much like me or my parents or things like that. And I think the next step is like having representation, but also having people who are aware of issues like this. So it is so important to have that representation, but also making sure that people know where certain biases come from, and that that they're not only that they're aware of some of the anti-race, aware of anti-racism, methods, and just knowing that they're not perpetuating self-hate. So those are the things. So I want to make sure we represent it, but I also want to make sure people are aware of some of the influences that may have them, as going back to, not to go back to that conversation, but having them think that things are bad or putting morality on things when it really is just, it's not bad, it's just another way of being. Or it's another, there are more healthy ways to eat. There are different ways to operate, and taking that morality off of it and really knowing the whys and where things come from. But I've seen a lot of that in Detroit. It's so great that we have a lot of community gardens that are run by folks from that community who are intentional. So I think the thing is to be intentional, to not just be there, but to be intentional about the way that you do, and to be really working on behalf of your community and actively trying to make things better for them in a positive way.
Winona, that really resonates with me on such a deep level, because I really feel like that that deep learning and understanding, especially for white folks, is so essential. You know, just speaking from my own experience within the Wallace Center, you know, when I started a few years ago, that like deep level of analysis and understanding about how race and racial inequity shapes the food system and shapes literally all of our interactions, all the things that we're trying to shift when we talk about food systems change, that deep sense of kind of analysis and understanding of both the like the systemic challenges and the nuances to our interactions as peers and colleagues and partners within this work within the nonprofit field, in our relationships with the folks that we serve. And in our case, that's food systems leaders that are leading community work. And then also working with foundations, et cetera. Like if we don't have a deep understanding of these systems of inequity, we are just going to perpetuate it. And so, you know, when I started at Wallace Center, it was pretty clear, and for myself too, that we didn't have that level of analysis and understanding that was necessary in order to be an effective organization doing food systems change. And so we've been on a journey over the last couple of years of really trying to sharpen our irons and understand, you know, in a much more sophisticated way of like our role in perpetuating white supremacy in the work that the Wallace Center has been doing over the years, and like what we can do as a national intermediary organization to shift that. And it's hard. It is like, it's so nuanced. I look at, you know, how does racial inequity show up in our organization, and just, you know, the fact that we are still a predominantly white team. And when I start to like pick that apart, I realize how structures of white supremacy have shaped and upheld our organization over the years. And it's not like, you know, white folks out with the Confederate flags in the White House kind of white supremacy, which I think, you know, a lot of times when people hear those words, that's what they immediately picture, right? Is like outright racist. And to me, what I've come to understand is how insidious and quiet and like almost seemingly innocuous white supremacy shows up in the workplace to end up like reinforcing these systems within the nonprofit industrial complex, within the, you know, quote unquote good food movement. For example, you know, our organization's history of using internships as sort of an on-ramp into employment. You know, we have a couple of folks that was how they kind of entered the team. And we know like folks who are able to take a low wage internship is generally are coming from a more privileged background. And that's just, you know, that seems like, oh, great, you know, an internship is a great way to come into an organization. That's one way you could look at that, right? But you start to really peel it apart and examine these practices, and you realize like how that perpetuates having a white dominant perspective in our organization. And so that's something that we've been really trying to pick apart and analyze and reset the table, so to speak, within our organization and within, and I think, you know, through the FSLN, the Food Systems Leadership Network, is our primary way of kind of really shifting that right now through our programming. But I don't know, just trying to take that, Winona, what you were saying about analysis and understanding how that is at every level, right? As us as individuals, as leaders, as a national organization, et cetera. So sorry, I know I took a lot of air there. I got a little passionate sharing, but just like something that we've been really wrestling with within our own organization these last couple of years.
No, Susan, I no need to apologize for the passion, and thank you for being transparent and for going and engaging in that. I think you brought us to a really good segue into our last question that we wanted to hold space for, because it's talking about what are the action items, what are the next steps, and I know that that can be kind of like maybe problematic too, and it's like, well, what do we do? What do we do? But what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? As in, after people engage in this dialogue about equity and anti-racism, then what? So we're not just having these conversations to like check boxes, like I'm a good person because I've had so many conversations or I've listened to topics on this, but what do we really do to change behavior or even to change outcome and existence for folks? So And just one more thing on that, when we have these conversations and they die away, or you're by yourself and you're really in a moment, how can this morph into actual action, into you doing things different than you used to, now that you have this information?
I look at this in the sense of extending the conversation. And for example, if I'm sitting, all of us that are engaged in these conversations are obviously interested in the topics, right? But when we leave this space and go out and have other conversations, this is for Black folks and white folks or whoever, what are you saying to the folks outside of your food circles when you go home and your friend circles and everybody else who may be the ones that really need to hear this information? And I can say this, we talked about white supremacy and pushing this, and I'll even put this out directly for white folks that are interested in the topics. When you leave these spaces, these safe spaces of this conversation, of people who are like-minded, what about when you go and talk to your friends or your people you hang out with in the bars you hang out with, and folks who may not think like that? That's how we make a change. And people have got to be able to hear and be exposed to a differing experience and differing opinion. And for those of us Black folks and other folks of color who are engaged in these, don't be afraid to tell your stories and be afraid to share your perspective about the world, because only then will people know and understand. If I walk around here at LSU every day and not express my viewpoints, folks here think that I think just like them, and I'm 99% sure most of the people here I think completely opposite of them on different issues. And so, not being afraid to be yourself, but also extending the conversation outside of these safe spaces where we have these conversations.
Thanks for that, Marcus. And what I'm thinking about is at the organizational level, how do we extend these conversations? And I think a lot of what we saw over the summer with the racial justice reckoning and the murder of George Floyd is a lot of predominantly white organizations had this sort of jolt of like, oh, I should have been doing work around this for so much longer, and now I'm late to the party, or I'm late to the conversation, and I have to release a statement, or we have to make some sort of big public facing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's like, but where's the commitment behind those statements? And what are the resources that people are willing to invest into actually operationalizing these big statements and public facing commitments that we're making? Because it's not like equity and diversity and inclusion and dismantling white supremacy, those aren't extra things, right? Those are in the DNA of an organization. Those are central to the work that we do. And so it's a serious undertaking. And so if it's a knee-jerk reaction, you're not going to engage with it with the seriousness that it truly requires. It can't be an afterthought. So just really sitting with those questions about deep reflection as staff, individuals, and as an organization. Really asking that question, how serious are we about this? Because everybody's going to say, oh, we're serious, but what are you willing to sacrifice? What resources are you willing to shift? What decisions are you willing to make? And so I think maybe just to land the plane here, like right sizing this question of not just like, oh, we need to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you say that you're going to do that, just being really aware and eyes wide open about what that sort of process entails moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately that's about culture shift too within an organization, which is a big undertaking. It's really difficult. And how, cultures within an organization get ossified over time. And even if you may have personnel change, and it's fascinating how an organizational culture will like perpetuate despite that personnel change. And so, that's something that we've been really, really focusing on within the Wallace Center is like, how do we build a more human-centered culture that makes our organization a safe and supportive place for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to come and work with us? Like, we have to do that work before we say, oh, we need to diversify our team, which is also a very high priority. But if we just start trying to hire people of color and then don't have a supportive workplace that actually just harms people more than, you know, the trade-offs there is dangerous. And so that's something that we've really been paying attention to. And it's really tough when we start looking at how white supremacy shows up in our organization, in our culture, through, you know, sense of urgency. Y'all have probably seen this, the Tima Okun resource that really lays out the different characteristics of white supremacy in the workplace. And I think we could all look at those and say, wow, this is how a lot of nonprofits operate. It's kind of built upon some of these structures of racial inequity and white supremacy, and it takes a lot of intention and hard work and process to break that down. And to your point, you know, resources, and whether that resources in financial resources or just time and attention. Of which, you know, we were coming into this call today, we were saying like we don't have enough time to give real attention and intention to the work that is called of us right now. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road, is being able to like dedicate staff time to doing the work. And whether that's, you know, the doing the work for white folks might be, you know, deepening the analysis, like spending time reading and, you know, listening and really digging in deep, doing that personal, the personal work that's required of white folks to examine our own biases and you know, just how this is shaping the lens through which we experience the world and our work. It takes time and commitment. And I want to see, you know, more organizations like really committing to that, and creating time and space for their staff members to do that work.
It's so being intentional and really putting in an action plan. I know, even though, of course, I'm a Black woman, so we have a Black led organization, we still need to look at, we realized we needed to look at who each program, who each thing that we put in place, who it benefits and who pays, and really asking those questions and making sure that what we are intending to do is what's happening. And also, calling out and calling in. I really think about how Marcus talked about extending those conversations, and it's at all levels. I mean, even when we ask, you know, what organizations get funded, what projects get funded, what are those criteria, and so much of that lends to that uneven playing field. And so when we see those things, calling them out, and then even offering solutions or offering what would be better. And I find myself doing a lot of that, making sure that I not only call something out, but try to offer what would be helpful to me, or what I think would be helpful as well.
I think that this is I really like the things that I heard, especially, well, all of it. And I think as I'm reflecting back and thinking into this deep, because sometimes it can seem so big because it's just on so many levels. It's systemic, it's in nonprofits. I'm coming from a university, it's in funding disparities with like 1890s, 1862 organizations. It's like, it's one of those things, it's like the air, like how do you catch it or how do you touch it? Like I'm breathing it, I'm all up in it. But one of the things that I land back on, and I heard earlier, I think you said, Susan, about culture, like it's ingrained in us. So that's like culture. You can't touch the culture, but you're a part of the culture. It shapes you. It's like what it is. So I think that we have to definitely tell. And I think the way to change the culture is the stories. Like stories inform culture. The stories are how we shift culture, how we tell what the culture is, you know, like, oh, did you see such and such do this? Like that's how the culture spreads, through oral tradition, through story. And not just oral, however stories are told, visual, media, just those stories that we tell. And so when I think about the stories that we tell, I know that we're moving into these movements about, we're always like, it's always shifting, like we're finding new words. Like, so I know we've gone from like, equality to equity, and now it's like anti-racism. But for me, I feel like the next shift in the story has to become anti-Blackness, because, and it's not just because 4 people on this panel are Black, it's because Black poverty should not exist. Like it should not exist. And when you think about our country, and when you think about our food system, and you think about enslavement, and that way that shaped and bore all of us, like not just our food system, but you know, our global economic systems. It goes on and on, right? And so I think a lot of times you hear about African descendants of slavery, or you hear about people who have descended of slavery, but if you want to keep it real, we are all descendants of slavery in some form, whether it be genetically, whether it be culturally, and even symbolically. So I feel like we have to let our ancestors rest through us. And so I feel like not even, there's the economic side, there's like reparations and doing things like that to repair. But also I feel like claiming that, yes, we can, we're just now getting to a precipice where we can openly talk about white supremacy, like Susan said, without people getting triggered and immediately thinking about Nazis and like just craziness. Like we're finally at a place where it's like, no, white supremacy is like too many emails. The example you shared, like this is white supremacy. Like we can kind of like conceptualize it. But now I think we have to understand what anti-Blackness is. And we isn't everybody. And it's not about the oppression Olympics. Like, well, what about the indigenous people? What about this? What about this? Anti-Blackness exists in every culture, every race. It exists within Black people. It, like white supremacy, how that can exist in you, anti-Blackness can exist in you. When you're like, well, let me do my hair like this before I go to this meeting because I got to do this. Let me do this. Let me, you know, we are all tiptoeing around anti-Blackness, whatever culture you come from. And so I feel like a real action step forward is we need to investigate what anti-Blackness is and how it is you know, if there are two coins, there's white supremacy, true, but you cannot have white supremacy without anti-Blackness. And so I think that that needs to be investigated, and not from this side of like, oh, Black Lives Matter, or it's specifically for Black people, but it's that knee-jerk reaction we get when things are specifically for Black people because of the trauma that is imbued in all of us. So that's just what I would share in the way that we could shift the culture and to start shifting our language and to start not only looking at anti-racism, but anti-Blackness.
I don't even know how to respond to that. Everything you're saying, Lindsay, is so powerful. And it just reminds me of your piece, Welcome to the Lemonade Village, and how your spoken word piece, that's originally how you and I connected, you sharing that at that Community Food Systems conference. And then you also sharing it at the FSLN retreat in New Orleans, and how that opened up the most powerful space for like real dialogue in a group of, what was it, about 25 multiracial folks, that it was like the power of your spoken word in a complete paradigm shift and like it was the most pro-Blackness like piece that I've personally witnessed. And it was transformative, I think, for everyone that experienced that, and how art and culture can like bust open spaces for real, genuine connection and dialogue around these things that we're talking about. Like, I feel like we need to use that more, like using different ways to kind of come into the conversation to create a container, to really be vulnerable. Because when I'm thinking back on the conversation that we had after you shared Welcome to the Lemonade Village in New Orleans, that was one of the most vulnerable and brave conversations in a group of people that I've ever witnessed. So I want to see more of that, like, you know, using art and culture as a way of busting open the doors, to really have brave and vulnerable and real conversations, more within this, you know, this community of food systems leaders. I think we're kind of coming to a little bit of a natural close to our conversation, possibly, but this has been so powerful. I just want to, I wonder if we just like kind of open up the space for like what stands out to you from this conversation. Like what's the nugget that you're going to take forth and that's nourished you through this conversation today that you want to carry forth into the rest of your day and your work?
I appreciate the comments about anti-Blackness. And I think one of the things people have to realize is that when we talk about America, we talk about the country, or this notion of our country that we've heard so much over the past several years, is that we oftentimes try to put this thing into a melting pot or whitewash it. And in reality, what we're dealing with is a salad. And each community, each race, each body of people comes together to make that salad what it is. And until we come to grips with that, that's the composition of it. Um, Not much is going to change. We have to appreciate each body or person or community or individual for what they are. One of the things that I don't like is this term BIPOC has now become the thing. And I've been in several meetings where somebody said, and I've strategically asked, like, what is that? As usually the black person in the room, I was like, what is that? And they'll explain what that is. And I was like, no, I'm black, right? And I don't group me in everybody else. And we have to learn and understand and appreciate different cultures and different races and different people for what they are. And so I definitely appreciate, the piece of the point that Lindsay brought up about anti-Blackness and calling that out and making that an issue. And we've got to get more people that are interested in that topic and that are willing to push that forward and not afraid to do so. And we got to get those type of warriors out there to do that work.
Yeah, I'm also so glad that you wove anti-Blackness into the conversation and made sure that was a part of what we're talking about. I think also just what Marcus just said is making me think about, right, when we have this salad, we have multicultural spaces and communities and experiences. But when we have predominantly white-led organizations or white leaders, or we live inside of a white supremacist country, it's like whiteness becomes the norm through which we try to have collaborations. And whiteness is violence, and whiteness is an impediment to collaboration. And I think so much of what we're trying to do in community food system work is just figure out how to take better care of each other, how to make sure that our communities have our basic needs met. And if whiteness continues to be this giant impediment to cross-cultural, multicultural collaboration, it's like we're not going to be able to figure out how to be with each other and take better care of each other if we keep bumping up against whiteness. And it's white folks' responsibility to look more closely at ourselves and our culture and our organizations to really understand how we have internalized whiteness and how we act out whiteness and how whiteness becomes the stumbling block to the work that we're trying to do in our communities.
There are so many nuggets that I'll take with me from this conversation, and I can't wait to listen to it, honestly, just to hear again from everyone. And just I want to take a moment to appreciate the authenticity and the flow that happened here. It was just such a powerful experience. One quote comes to mind to me. It's from Zora Neale Hurston. She's one of my personal favorites and just like a personal North Star and anthropologist queen for me. And it's that if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And so the way that relates back to this dialogue is just don't be scared to have those tough conversations. And like Marcus was saying, not just in these safe spaces where there's an anti-racism or anti-Blackness focus, an anti-Blackness focused lens, but have those conversations. And I'm talking to my white peers and white colleagues and white listeners, especially. Talk to, your cousins, your friends, your colleagues about racism. And I don't know that all white people understand the position of power and influence they're in, because there's no cultural diversity training or anti-racism training that people will be receptive to in the way that they will their loved ones, bringing up a really tough conversation. So I just want to encourage people to have conversations, and a part of those conversations are action oriented, in that you got to have those conversations with people who are in your community who already trust you. Like, that is the biggest work that I would just like to charge allies with, is just don't be scared. Don't just exist in these safe, really, constructed spaces. Do it in your communities, and you're literally changing the world with every conversation that you have like that.
Thanks, Shelley.
You're welcome.
I think I was listening so deep to what Shelley was saying, because I think I even took nuggets just from hearing that. I think what I'm really walking away too with is just kind of, I think I even wrote it down when you said it, Susan, art and culture to bust open the doors. I think like it kind of recentered and refocused for me, like the power of art. I think sometimes you think like, is it this law that I could help, or this policy, or like this thing that I could do? And sometimes you, and I don't know, I think that could be like the world too, but sometimes you overlook your natural gifts and talents and things that you have. So I think that it refocused and recentered in myself, my own duty of like how I want to fight this fight, and sharing in other non-traditional, because you just want to make this academic paper or like get published and like these people read it and it's like, oh my God, here's the answer to racism. But no, like maybe it's just like a really nice poem that inspires someone and kind of like changes it. So that's also something I would say, to building off of what Shirley said, is speaking. I heard a man say, he said, he was quoting a proverb that he had heard, and he said that if you despise something, then it's your duty to act against it physically, to stop it from happening. But if you can't, because you can't do that, then you have to speak against it. You have to say that it is wrong. Like you must declare it wrong. But if you can't do either of those things, like if fate binds you to where you can't act against it or speak against it, then in your heart, you must rebel. In your heart, you must know it's wrong. Like inside of you, you know it's wrong. And so I just take that with me to say that, like, in whatever situation you're in, like, know what's right for you. And so it's not to take away the power and say, like, don't speak out. Speak out. It's your duty. When you can speak, speak. When you can physically act, act, which means donate, do work, support other people. But at the end of the day, if you don't have whatever it takes in that situation, like you need to know with inside yourself that's wrong. So I think that that's just to say that a lot of this battle is personal. Some people are still trying to really figure out which side of the fence they're on, and that's wrong. Like, not saying wrong, but that's also a place to start from there. Inside yourself, you need to understand like where you stand on this.
Mhm. Anybody else?
Just taking it all in. I love it.
I know.
This was a really, really an enjoyable conversation. I'm glad that we all took the time to have it.
Yeah. Thank y'all so much for just your bravery and vulnerability and honesty and brilliance. I mean, as I was listening to each of you speak, I was just like, God, I am surrounded by brilliance. And it gives me a lot of hope for our work, for this movement that needs a new name. And also just like gets me really excited about the future of the Food Systems Leadership Network as a platform for connecting people in a really meaningful and authentic way, and wanting to have a lot more conversations like this, to where, I think that it just like pulls back the layers of the onion and getting down to what you're saying, Lindsay, like at the heart of the matter, like what's in your heart, and if we can really get that right, everything else comes from there. So if we can like get as I don't know, grounded and centered in a place of truth and clarity inside of ourselves as individuals, like that is going to have a tremendous impact in everything that we do. So I just love y'all, and I'm really grateful to know you through this work. And I think that's kind of the wrap of it. So it was a great conversation, a great meal. Next time, let's do this in person.
We'll have a big crawfish ball in South Louisiana.
Yes, that sounds good. We intended on having a crawfish bowl at the Wallace Center's conference in New Orleans in March, right when the pandemic was hitting, and we had to cancel everything at the end of the last day of the conference. So I'm advocating for us to do our 2022 conference back in New Orleans so we can like do it right.
Make up for it. Yeah.
Oysters.
Yes. Sweet. I'm gonna stop the recording now.